Okay, let's get started. Again, my name is Steve Wilson. I'm with the Illinois State Water Survey, and I have with me Dan Webb, who's also at the Water Survey. He runs our Public Service Lab, and Katie Hollenbeck, who works at the Illinois Water Resources Center at the U of I. And I want to mention this is Well Care 101, what you need to know to protect your family. This is a monthly webinar series we run through the private well class, which is a program that's funded and sponsored by the Rural Community Assistance Partnership and the US EPA. And if one of the questions I'll ask later is about whether or not you signed up for this webinar, if you've actually taken the class, it's 10 lessons that are sent to you via email, and it's something that you should really try to take advantage of. It's all free and supported by by the US EPA, and it's worth the time. So, hang on here. So a little bit about today's webinar. It's part of a national program that's being implemented through RCAP, and just to support well owners. So there's a lot of materials, and I'll speak a little bit about that at the end. But this webinar follows our free well owner course available at privatewellclass.org. This is just one little piece of it. And we are recording this webinar. We record all of our webinars, and they're available on our website under videos and or on YouTube. It'll be about a week probably before this particular webinar is up, but all of our past webinars, and there's well over 20 I believe, are also online. And when you registered, you were given a chance to ask questions. We received a lot of questions, well over 100. We'll answer some of those today. Some were redundant, more than one person asked the same question, and some have been answered in previous webinars as well. And so we'll answer some of those that we've set up slides for, and then after that, if you have any other questions or something comes up today that you didn't think of before, or you've got a question about some of the material, Katie will be taking those questions. Use the question box on the go to webinar box that you have on your screen, and she'll compile those in a document that we can show at the end and go through. And Dan and I will try to do our best. So, all right. About today, really it's about the basics of well care and how to ensure your water is safe to drink. I mentioned these folks already. I won't go back through it again. And we do have a bunch of questions. I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. But so yeah, ask any additional questions you might have, and we'll do the questions after the short, about 25-minute presentation on well care basics. And so we're here for an hour and a half, and so hopefully there'll be enough time to do that. Some things to remember. Again, this webinar is really geared towards well owners, and in 99% of the country they're not regulated. It's really up to you as the owner to be sure your water's safe. You're basically the water operator for a very small system. I grew up on an old hand-dug well, and now I live in a community that has its own water supply, and so I'm drinking water that's, I pay $40 to $50 a month for my water, and that is spread out over all the residents that are on that's American Water, so that we have safe, clean, pressurized water at our tap anytime we want it. But as a well owner, that's your responsibility to make sure all the infrastructure is working, that your water is safe to drink, and those things. So really it comes down to there's some best practices like sampling your well water that can just help ensure and give you confidence that your water is fine to drink. Many times contaminants that are harmful have no odor, color, or taste, and so you can't rely on what it looks like. And honestly, many times when your water doesn't look clean, it's got a color or it's turbid, those things more than not are harmless and more of a taste issue, if anything. And it's the things like arsenic and some other contaminants that you can't see and you just need to test for. So as far as well considerations, we're not going to go into all the well basics, types of wells, and things like that. So that's a different webinar. But the things to remember is that generally deeper is better. A lot of well problems and a lot of contamination problems are because of influence from the surface. So a deeper well that's getting its water from a deeper aquifer generally has less risk of surface contamination. That's not always true. It depends on, the difference between a sand and gravel well that's 200 feet deep and a bedrock well that's 200 feet deep is that a sand and gravel well is cased the entire length of that 200 feet with a screen at the bottom. So the water's coming in from, say, 195 to 200 feet below land surface. Very well protected from any kind of surface influence. A bedrock well in the same instance could be 200 feet deep, but it may only have 30 feet of casing or even less because the bedrock acts as the casing below that. And so understanding those things certainly can make a difference. And the other reason deeper is generally better and not always better is some units that are deep in the ground may have a contaminant like arsenic or uranium or something else that's naturally occurring but regulated and causes health effects. And so it's just good to know those things. Other considerations for your well is where it's at on the landscape, especially if it's a shallower well or it can be influenced by the surface. If it's in a floodplain or if it's in an area where you're down gradient from possible contamination like a feedlot or even a barn or a storage shed that might have chemicals in it and those sorts of things, location matters. And again, another good example of that is dealing with flow direction. If you're in a rural subdivision where you're near a river somewhere and it's on a sloped landscape, the person who's highest elevation farthest away from the river, it's most likely that the general groundwater flow direction, at least in the shallow aquifers, is towards the river. And so if every person has a well and a septic and you're in this area where there's maybe 20 or 30 homes on a 20 or 30 acre plot, then that matters because if especially for shallower wells, then you could have septic influences from other folks. And so just understanding all these issues is really what you need to consider. As far as well construction, most problems occur because wells are older. They were installed prior to the current well construction code in your state, and they've always been grandfathered in. The well I grew up on was hand dug in 1933. It's not very safe. When it rains, we have cloudy water. And there's still a lot of pits today and hand dug wells, like I mentioned. In most states, two that don't have construction code are Pennsylvania and Alaska, have well construction codes today that would ensure your well is safe from surface influence. And so it's really a matter of understanding how old's your well, how long ago was it drilled, how was it put in, was it done by a licensed contractor, did it meet construction code, if they have it in your state, and those sorts of things. So, and really the most dangerous things are wells in pits and abandoned wells, and because of the two problems mentioned here, they provide an opportunity for surface contamination generally, and they're also a safety hazard. So, and to speak to that, here's a few examples. The Washington State Department of Ecology is the agency in Washington State that regulates drillers and well construction. They have a blog, and that's where this came from. This person probably walked over that plywood 1,000 times. This time it gave way and she fell to her death. It's not a safe way. They have a concrete block over their access hole. It's obviously a shallow well with a suction pump there, but you can see there's a funnel there. There's stuff on the ground. If there's mice in there, they can fall in the well. The second picture, I apologize, but this is a goat. And I was in southern Illinois, and a gentleman was taking pictures of old homesteads in the area and ran across this and was fortunate enough to share it with me. But these things can happen. People leave their wells open. This particular well actually wasn't in use at the time. Obviously, that's a good thing. And the third well here is a well we sampled as part of a research project looking at ag chemicals and nitrates in groundwater, in shallow groundwater. This is an old hand-dug well. It's covered with 2x6s and 2x8s and tin and concrete blocks. There's really not a lot to keep rats and mice and snakes and even probably rabbits from getting in that and falling in. Just not a safe way to maintain your well. And again, none of these wells probably would be in the well log files for your given state. just because they were older and probably before those laws were in place. So what should you do if you have a well like this? You know, the best thing you can do is to bring them up to code if it's possible. It'll protect the water quality because it eliminates the risk of surface contamination. But if it's in a pit, for instance, and it's actually just a regular drilled well that maybe has a 4 to 6 inch casing, then extend the pipe to the surface, fill that in with clay, and then you know, make it so that, like a well pit, for instance. I didn't show an example of that, but a lot of wells were put in pits in the old days because it was a way to not worry about the freezing ground. You know, like the frost line in Illinois is about 3.5 feet in a hard winter, depending on where you live. But that's why the pitless adapter was invented in the first place, and so you don't have to have a pit. You know, they're a safety hazard. They can fill with water, and then unless your well is sealed completely airtight at the cap, that water can then get in your well and contaminate it. I mentioned abandoned wells. Part of the problem is, you know, we've evolved as we move forward in understanding the risks to source water, our groundwater resources, and those things. And so well logs weren't even required in some states till the 60s, and many other states much later. Like, for instance, in New York, they didn't require well logs to be filed until 2000. There's some states where they still don't maintain those, or they don't enforce those laws. And so in most cases, there are more undocumented wells on file than wells that are actually known to exist. And a lot of those become abandoned. And again, if they're in a pit or they're an old dug well, they become a safety hazard. And I guess if you're a well owner in a rural property and you know you have an abandoned well, you should look at the last bullet. Anybody walks on your property and falls in that, you'll be liable. We see this happen all the time. People get killed. Animals get killed or maimed from falling in a well. And they also provide a pathway into an aquifer or can, and it could provide a way to contaminate the aquifer that you're using for your drinking water. So I know Katie and I participated in a well sealing demonstration, and it turned out these folks bought a home right in the middle of a community of 13,000 people where they've had city water since 1916, I believe, and this was just this year. They found this old well right next to their house in their backyard, still open, still a risk, and so they contacted the county health department and the university that's there, and they used it as a demonstration to seal it properly so that it's not a risk anymore to anyone. And again, this was right in the middle of a community, 4 blocks from downtown. And so they're everywhere. You just never know when you're going to find an abandoned well. Here's some examples. Again, the 2 pictures are both from Washington State Department of Ecology's blog. One shows a horse. The other, they're rescuing a man who fell 45 feet and was fortunate enough to survive. These newspaper clippings on the left, or on the right, excuse me, all but the third one are from Illinois. The third one is Jessica McClure, which, if you're old enough, many of you might remember. They rescued her as an 18-month-old over about 20 some hours, I believe, and it was shown live on CNN and made national news. But most of the time, these things don't make it past your local paper. So the bottom one is Springfield, Illinois. The Sangamon County woman found dead in a well. The other 2, Galesburg is in western Illinois, and Buffalo Grove is a Chicago suburb. And, you know, these articles never made it past their local papers. And so you don't hear about it nationally, but it happens a lot more than you think. So as far as basic well care, you know, when you're putting in a well, it's in some states, like in Illinois, if you're a landowner, you're allowed to put in your own well. We don't recommend that, or we wouldn't recommend that, just because unless you have experience doing so, you still have to meet well construction code, at least in Illinois you do. And so it's best just to have a licensed contractor so that if anything goes wrong or there's any problems, it's on them, not on you. Just like if you drink city water. If there's something wrong with the water, it's on the city, and they have to deal with it, and you're not responsible. So, you know, that's one best practice we want to mention. And same with repairing a well. Most states, or many states, have guides that tell you about well construction. If you're going to install a well on your property, it's best to be familiar with these and understand what might be happening. One thing I always tell people, so many times a well owner will call us and say they don't have the log. And I ask, who drilled your well? Well, they know who the driller is. They're actually the person who had the well installed, but the driller didn't have to file a log with the state, or they didn't. It's not available there, and they really don't want to share it because they have competition among their peers for drilling. One best practice would be to make sure that if you're drilling a well, that it's clear up front or in writing, that you'll get a complete copy of all the well log, everything that was put in the well, all the list of how much grout was used, all those sorts of things, so that you can keep a record and have some confidence in the way they installed your well, as well as if you need that information later, if there's ever a problem. As far as basic well care, visually what you can do is, check the cap, and this is just one example of a well, but this is a great example for me. I grew up on a farm, and we had a large yard to mow, and our well wasn't in the middle of our yard, but this looks just like a post that was in our yard, and I don't know how many times I hit that thing. And so, for instance, if this is PVC and you have a teenager mowing your yard, or anybody, and they hit this, they can crack the casing. That allows insects access, or even if there's a tree nearby. We had a case where they planted a tree next to their well. It was a PVC well, and sure enough, 15 years later, all of a sudden they started getting bacterial hits. And what had happened is a tree root had made its way over to by the well. As it continued to grow and get larger, it eventually cracked the casing, and those roots have a lot of animal use and bacteria and all those sorts of things. And even though they chlorinated their well, they kept getting bacteria hits because of it. So ensuring that your well is sealed properly, as well as protected from any other outside influence, is really important. And that's really the best thing you can do to ensure surface that you're eliminating, or certainly limiting, surface influence to your well. I show this as just one example for the state of Minnesota. It's actually pretty thorough, so I like using this page, but this is just to show you all the different things that can affect a well and why they have setbacks. And so when you're installing a new well, if you buy a property and you're going to put in a well, you have to meet all these isolation distance requirements in Minnesota. And these numbers are Minnesota numbers. It may be different in your state, but it's good to understand all of these things could have an effect on a well. So if you have, a shallow bored well or a dug well or a sand point, you need to consider, especially a sand point where it's sandy soil at the surface, that these things certainly could influence the quality of the water in your well. When you turn on your well, or when you pump your well, you lower the water level in your well. Water wants to be flat, and so when you lower the water level at the well, then water starts flowing towards your well from all directions. And so that's how contaminants move towards your well and get in your well. It's because you've created a water level difference. And just like if you have water on a table and you lift one end up, it runs down to the other end, the lower end. Water wants to go downhill and be at the least pressure it can be. And so it wants to always remain flat. And so it's going to try to fill in the water that's been taken out by the well to make that all the same pressure. So it's certainly a risk. Here's the bottom half of that page. And again, you can see some of these things like electric lines. Many times we see where someone has a well, they decide to add a piece of a building or some other equipment or whatever around their home or farmstead, and all of a sudden there's no way to access the well. We had a case which is pretty extreme where they had a submersible pump in their well. They went ahead and decided that they needed to have a garage. The well was below grade, so they just basically put a concrete pad over the top of it and put a garage up. And so now they have no way to get in their well to replace their pump, no way to service anything, and it's just lack of understanding that your well is an investment and you need to protect it. You need to always have access to what's there. So as far as septic systems go, a lot of times when you have bacterial problems, it ends up being it's a shallow well and there's some kind of septic problem. A septic system is a wastewater treatment system, just like a community has a wastewater treatment plant. Simple design. It's meant to take care of the waste from your home, and if you use it properly, it'll function properly for a long time. We've seen some that are, many decades old, others that fail in less than 10 years because they weren't managed. So this is a typical design. Coming from your house, it goes into a 2-compartment septic tank. The solids fall to the bottom. The rest of the material, there's bacteria in there that break things down. The water runs out through the end pipe into a junction box and goes out into some kind of absorption field in a typical design, where then it can go into the soil and be broken down further. So as far as a to-do list for your septic system, there's bacteria there. So if it's close to your well, or if the gradient is towards your well, it can cause problems. And it can also fail if you aren't maintaining it. So, I've had people tell us, we've never had to pump our septic tank, or we haven't pumped our septic tank in 20 years. It works just fine. That's not going to always be the case. It will not last forever. They need to be pumped, and they need to be accessible. Also, no trees, because those roots get in and mess with the piping, especially the perforated piping in the drain field. And then also concrete or asphalt, or putting a road, driving vehicles over that area compacts the soil and makes it less effective in distributing the water that comes out after it's been through the system. So one thing you can do to make your septic system last longer is reduce the flow of water that goes into your septic system. So you shouldn't have your sump or your softener backwash or things like a whirlpool. You should also, that extra flow gives the bacteria less time to break things down, and so then you end up with more solids, and it needs to be maintained more, pumped sooner. And the same with the garbage disposal. Garbage disposals cause a lot of solids in your septic tank. And I know, like the National Environmental Services Center, which does a lot of wastewater work, has a chart that basically says if you have a garbage disposal, you should have the time that you have your tank pumped. And so, there's charts available that say if your tank is 750-gallon tank and you've got 4 people living on the home, then you should do this often. If it's 2 people and a 1,000-gallon tank, then it's less often. But you should have a schedule for maintaining and pumping your septic to make sure that the solids don't overtake the baffles inside of there and eventually clog up your drain field. And, it's a natural system that works on bacteria, the bacteria from our bodies. And so adding things like paint, pills, especially things that might be antibacterial, can really cause those things not to work as well, or you can kill off the bacteria in your septic tank, and that will render it basically useless as far as breaking things down. So you can inspect your tank to measure the solids. You can have someone do that for you if you don't know how, a septic installer, or and then again, pump your tank on a regular schedule. The other thing is testing. It's really important that you test your well regularly. Anytime you open your well, or if you ever notice a change in taste, odor, or color, anything that's different, or if you have your pump serviced, or any of those things. But as far as testing your well annually, what's recommended is testing for coliform and nitrate. And the reason isn't because coliform and nitrate are necessarily a health risk on their own. Obviously, nitrate can be for babies because of blue baby syndrome and stuff, but they indicate a pathway into your well. You shouldn't have high nitrate or coliform at all, and if you do, it usually indicates that there's some pathway into your well from the surface. and that's why it's a really good way to evaluate that particular component. So what do you test for? Well, it's really different in every situation. It really depends on the aquifer you're in, how deep your well is, where you're at in, are you in an urban or rural setting? A lot of those things. But your county or local and state health department, you should contact them for advice. If you're getting your well sampled on your own, or I said 99% of the country, there's a few counties where at the sale of property transfer, if you test your well and it comes up with some kind of contaminant, they can force you to add treatment or change that. There's a county in New York, and I think in Rhode Island they may try to encourage you to do those things. But in most of the country, the health department is there just to give you advice. They have no authority to tell you can or can't drink your water. And so it's good to lean on those folks. They care about your health, and ask them if there's anything naturally occurring. I know, as a good example, Tazewell County, Illinois, if you called the Tazewell County Health Department and asked them if there's any contaminants of concern in the groundwater there, they're going to say, yeah, we have a fair amount of arsenic in our groundwater, our sand and gravel aquifers. So if you have a well in the Glassford or the Muhammad aquifer, we'd certainly recommend you test for arsenic. And so those things are really helpful. I'll show you some examples in a minute, but other folks you can ask too. Ask your neighbors or a driller, co-op extension. If they're active in your county or your area, we'll probably know if there's something there. And then again, sample for coliform nitrate annually as they indicate a pathway into your well. So just some examples real quick. This is Massachusetts State Department of Environmental Protection's website. They've set up, there's enough arsenic and uranium in their bedrock that they've set up this web page where if you live there, you can type in your address and it will tell you whether you should be concerned about one or both of those contaminants. And, there's things over here on the side, where to find a certified testing lab, towns where they know there's probability for arsenic, and those sorts of things. Similarly, Rhode Island, this is from their Rhode Island Department of Health on their webpage. All the little circles are where there used to be orchards, and they're very prevalent, and arsenic was heavily used for many years in orchard production. And so in a lot of these places, even the soil has a level of arsenic that's well beyond what's acceptable for even putting in a new building. And this big splotch in the middle third there, is beryllium. Until I found this map on their website, I didn't even know beryllium was a regulated contaminant, but it is. It has an MCL. It's a primary drinking water contaminant listed by US EPA, and they happen to have naturally occurring beryllium in this area. And so they're giving you some advice there if you just go look and search on what to be concerned about. The state of Wisconsin, their DNR, has put together, working with the University of Stevens Point, this interactive mapping display where you can go in, and I've clicked on, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, I clicked on arsenic by county and show it. So it shows from the samples they have, there's one county where there's been none detected. There's many others where it's less than 5 micrograms per liter. And if you're not aware, the standard for a community water supply is 10 micrograms per liter, or 10 ppb. And so it shows you here where they've had some higher levels of arsenic, and it might be a concern. It tells you as a homeowner, if you're in one of these areas, maybe not to just run out and sample for arsenic, but maybe to contact your county health department and ask them just how prevalent it is. And so you can make an informed decision on whether or not you want to test for that. So, and lastly, I show this one last because it has so much more than water quality. But the Washington State Department of Ecology has this website where most of these are private wells. It says 2231 locations selected, search criteria, water supply well domestic. And so, and I'm not 100% sure that some of these might not be community water supplies, but most of them are private wells. Not only can you see water quality for an individual well, but you can also see if they've got hydrograph and well data, which means a hydrograph is water level changes, and then a link to the well log in some cases if it's there. And so you can narrow this search down, and if it's in an area where you live, you can see what the water quality might be for someone who's already sampled in your area. And so the point of all this is there are a lot of tools available if you know where to look. And one of the things we would encourage is that you take a little time to find out who your agency is that regulates well construction and drillers, who houses the well logs in your state, who makes all the geologic maps and those sorts of things, and who is taking care of water quality issues in both your state and your local jurisdiction. And there may be information available right online. So what we suggest, this is just what we've shown this list to a lot of folks and vetted it through some other state agencies and things. Again, annually for coliform and nitrate, we recommend testing every 3 to 5 years for this list that's shown here in the middle. And really, groundwater doesn't change that much. So if you have, for instance, when I go out and sample a well, I have monitoring wells around the state of Illinois, and if I go out and sample them today, the water quality is going to be very similar to what it was even 10 years ago. Just because groundwater in an aquifer doesn't change that quickly, it has the chemistry it has because of the natural minerals that are there, so it's good to sample every 3 to 5 years so you have a good feel for what the general chemistry is of the groundwater that you're getting your water from. And what this also does is, let's say that your alkalinity changes by threefold, or your pH goes from 8 to 6.5. That shouldn't happen naturally. And what it likely means is that something's compromised your well, or there's been some kind of contamination that's got into the aquifer, and it tells you that maybe you should investigate and find out if there might be something else going on that's caused that. So again, your local and state health department, they're the folks who are concerned with your health and well-being as far as the responsibility for that and trying to make sure that you're kept safe. And they're one of your best sources of information, and you should find out who the environmental health professional is in your local jurisdiction. Meet them, ask advice. They can probably tell you a lot about the groundwater in your area. So where do you get it analyzed? Again, every state accredits labs for sampling for the primary drinking water contaminants, so a community water supply can get their water tested and meet the regulations of the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so an accredited lab is generally the advice we would give. Now, in some cases, like in Illinois, we have a university lab that's not accredited anymore. It used to be, and I'll show you some examples of that in a little bit. But they still follow all the EPA methods, and it's really reporting requirements that we couldn't maintain. And so if you can find a lab that meets a lot of those criteria and is using the same methods, they will do just as well for you. At least ours certainly does. So also some states have programs for private well sampling. The two examples I usually mention are that Iowa has a Grants to Counties program where the counties can apply for funding from their state for either subsidizing well sampling costs or even for subsidizing filling in of abandoned wells. New Mexico has a program through their wastewater and their septic program that if you register your septic system, they'll give you a free water sample. And, some counties do things. I mentioned Tazewell County, Illinois earlier. They also, generally during Groundwater Awareness Week, which is usually a week in March, they offer free sampling during that week just to help raise awareness of private well and groundwater issues. So, but when you call a lab, they should be able to give you good instructions, tell you how to store your sample, all those things, even send you the samples. And if you have questions and they can't answer them, I would find a different lab. We also work with labs, and that's one of the big messages we give them, is that a well owner isn't necessarily going to have all the information they need and understand why they need to sample or exactly what they need to sample for. As the professional, the lab needs to know those things. And so we tell labs that we're telling well owners, go somewhere else if they can answer their questions, because they really should be able to. And a good lab will provide you bottles and everything else you need, instructions, all that stuff to help you get that done properly and following the right sampling criteria. So, and in some states, the lab actually comes out and collects the samples, and that's not a state program, but generally, for instance, I know because of fracking in some areas further east, they have, for your sample to be, quote, defensible, you need to have it sampled by someone else, not doing it yourself. So, so there's a lot of variability and differences depending on where you are and what reason you have for your sample collection. As far as interpreting results, there are websites available, and I'll show you one in a second, that you can go online and get a sense of what your results might be by typing them in. But you should never just rely on that for a qualified answer. You should always take it to your health department. They are health professionals again. I'll say that one more time. You should rely on those folks to help you understand what your sample results mean and look into how you might be able to remedy a situation if you have a problem. And we would always recommend taking a second sample, especially if you have a bacteria hit. It's probably worth taking a second sample to make sure that it wasn't some issue with how the sample is collected or somebody did something. It's really easy to contaminate a bacteria sample is the bottom line. So, but then if you do have a coliform test and it's positive, we would recommend then following up with an E. coli test and not drink your water unless you boil it until you can chlorinate it or you've solved the problem. So here's one example, and this just came out a year or two ago. The New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services developed this Be Well Informed guide. It's really a great tool. There's a button here at the bottom to enter your water test results, and this was developed by the state to help the citizens in New Hampshire, but it really is very appropriate for folks anywhere, because what they've done is tied this all to the primary drinking water standards. And so in general, there are no standards for private wells anywhere, and most of the time as a surrogate, folks use, especially regulators or those that are trying to evaluate whether a well is, quote, safe or not, use the primary drinking water contaminants for community water supplies as a surrogate for what's safe for a private well. And, that makes sense, though technically they're really for just community water supplies. So you can click on that button. For instance, I entered 15 for arsenic micrograms per liter. The standard's 10. And so I put in a value that's higher than the MCL, and I put in for the town or city up here, anonymous, which they allow, which is awesome. And instead of saying where I'm from, although if you're from New Hampshire, I encourage you to put the town or city. It gives the state information. That's all they ask. So you're still anonymous, but it gives them information then to better understand the water quality in New Hampshire. And that's certainly a valuable thing for doing outreach and education and helping well owners. So, so for this results, it said, arsenic, the value exceeds the drinking water limit. And so they then, actually what this did when I did this, it asked me if I had any other chemistry information I could add in, because arsenic and removing arsenic is based, the best method for removing arsenic, whether here they've said an absorptive media, a carbon filter that you can put on your kitchen tap, or a point of use reverse osmosis system, are the two typical results. And one of those will work better than the other depending on some other chemistry of your water. And I didn't put in any other values for iron or alkalinity or pH or anything else, but this particular website was developed so that it takes all those things into account. And so it's really pretty useful, because not only does it tell you have a problem, but it also recommends treatment. So, and even though, again, you should take this information then to a qualified professional to get their advice, it certainly steers you in the right direction. And as you go down through this page, it asks, here's some of the other things at the bottom that I could have entered, but it tells you what your treatment options are and what can happen, your health concerns if you drink water with high arsenic. And so it provides a lot of good information. And I'll say one more time, these are only a guide and for typical water, so you should always take your results to get a qualified answer. And and in general, they can't tell you to stop drinking your water, nor will they. They can't contaminate your well. I get so many questions about that. Well, if I go to the county health department, they're going to tell me I can't use my well anymore. Well, no, they really don't have the authority to do that. So they can make recommendations, and they can say how much they care about the fact that, you and your family might be drinking it, but it's really up to you to take care of your well and whether you drink it or not. And, we run across folks all the time who, well, my dad lived here till he was 86, and he drank the water and he was fine, and so there's nothing wrong with it. I don't care what the test shows. My advice in that case is you move on. Some people, you can only help them so much, and, they have to decide what they want for themselves. As far as treatment, the real message for treatment is that no matter what kind of treatment you have, whether it's even just a water softener or a filter, or if it's something like an RO unit or, whatever it might be, you need to be strict about following the maintenance and replacement schedule. I actually had, when we first started our class almost 4 years ago now, one of the state health departments asked me not to put information in about treatment in our class. And his sole motivation was that he runs into more homes where they don't maintain their treatment unit, and it's caused more problems for the health of the family than it's helped. And so, for instance, you don't change a filter, or you don't take care of some of these things, they can harbor bacteria and become a source of nutrients for those bacteria. And all of a sudden, you're running your water through this old filter or whatever that's actually introducing more bacteria into your water before it comes out your tap. And so that's really the message. If you're going to bother to have treatment, you need to understand that it's a lifelong commitment, and you need to change out filters and maintain it the way it says, and follow all the recommendations. So that's really all I have for today as far as our CAN program, if you will. But I want to get to the questions. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, we had many questions, and we can't answer them all. And so, especially if you just signed up in the last few days, we probably won't get to those today. But we'll answer some of the questions, and we've lumped some together. And what we are doing is we're working on a web page, kind of an FAQ, that will include all of the questions, or in some form, the questions that I'm going to ask about all the topics that are related here. And that will be up live on our website by the end of January. And so as we get new questions, we update that, and we haven't launched it yet. We're still working on some of the, needs to have a search feature and some of those things so that it's easy to use. And as soon as we get that up, we'll certainly send something out to everyone. But all of those questions will be on there in some form. So, and if you do have questions today, and a few of you already have, it looks like, Katie is taking those down, and we'll be putting those in a Google Doc that I can just pull over onto the screen, and we'll do that at the end. So if you do have questions, again, use the question box, and we'll try to get to those. So first question, how do I find out what aquifer a well is using? So really, there's two things you need to know. You need to know information about your well, so you know how deep it is, so you can understand what formation it might be tapping. And then you also need to understand the geology of your area. And so, if it's your well log can tell you, it'll tell you the type of well. I mentioned a drilled well that's with a screen, or if it's a bedrock well, it could be really deep, but only have 30 or 40 feet of casing in some cases. And then that will help you understand your water source. Like for instance, in New York, there's a lot of bedrock wells where the casing may be less than 30 or 40 feet, but the well might be as much as 200 or 300 feet deep. And that means your water's coming from at the bottom of that casing, say 30 feet below land surface, all the way down to the 200 or 300 total depth. So any cracks or fissures in the rock that intersect that well bore will provide water to the well. And so you could have water coming from more than one geologic unit in that case. And so they could have different chemistries. So there's a lot of issues. And that's where either state agency or a federal USGS office, I know in New York, the USGS is pretty active with a lot of the, as they are in many states, with understanding the geology and hydrology of groundwater Also, I said GS means Geological Survey, the State Geological Survey, or whatever they might be called, the other agency in your state. So in Wisconsin, it's DNR. Michigan, it's DEQ. In Washington State, it's DEC, Department of Ecology. And so, as I mentioned earlier, find out who those agencies are. And it's really simple. Usually you can say state, so say Illinois well logs, and you'll probably see the Illinois State Water Survey and the Illinois State Geological Survey come up as the top hits. And in Missouri, it would be DNR. So you can find those things, and those folks can help you. And if you want to understand, in some cases, like the Washington State site I showed you, where you can look at logs, you might find, especially if you're in like a rural subdivision where they were all put in by a contractor at the same time, it's very likely that most of those wells are very near the same depth. And so if you can find your neighbor's log online, it's probably it's a good indication of what yours might be if, for instance, your log isn't there. And so, but there's folks who will help you at those agencies if you just call them and contact them. And there's actually a lot of help out there, and they're glad to help. And I know that's what I do. One of my jobs is to help well owners in Illinois with those kind of questions. So, and I should mention, Dan, are you on there, on the line?
Yeah, Steve, I'm here.
So Dan Webb's here as well. He runs our public service lab. I forgot to introduce you again. And here's, for instance, so if there's anything related to water quality, usually that's more his purview than mine. I'm a groundwater hydrologist. But someone asked, when's it best to collect a water sample from a faucet in the house, and when's it best to sample at or near the well? And, my take on that is what Dan's lab does is they usually talk to the well owner first and find out, if they have treatment, those sorts of things. And if so, they usually try to get them to sample both places. And the outside tap, or a tap that's before any treatment, is more representative of the well water or the natural groundwater. And a lot of times, like the work I do for research, is to look at groundwater quality. And so I'm trying to find a spigot close to the well, and I'll let it run till I know that the water's coming directly from the well and hasn't been sitting in pipes too long, so that I'm getting a natural groundwater sample. Versus your kitchen tap, which may be after a filter or a softener or even an RO unit, which is representative of your drinking water. It's what you're putting in your pots whenever you're boiling water. It's what you're getting your glass of water from that you're drinking. And, those can be significantly different because of both sitting in your pipes and because of the treatment. And so we would recommend both. And, Dan, do you have anything to add to that?
No, that's a good answer, Steve. Yeah, just what you said.
Okay, and I want to show an example here, and Dan provided me these results. This is a well owner who had their water sampled, and they have a filter, a softener, and an RO unit. And so what I want to point out here is this is the raw sample that was collected from an outside spigot. So sodium was 25.9, hardness was 351, the pH is 8.2. So then they ran it through a softener and a filter, and, running it through the softener, now the hardness is 0.68, went from whatever that was, 351 to 0.68. The sodium went from 25 to 198, and the pH went up just a little bit. But you can see what that does. It changes the chemistry significantly. And if we do that again, calcium's way down, all those things on the left there. And so understanding that it actually changes your chemistry. So for instance, if somebody's on a low sodium diet, running water through your softener might make a difference. And then after this, it also then went through an RO unit, which basically takes out, you can explain this better than I can, Dan, but it basically takes out everything. And so when you look at this result, all those little less than arrows means it's below the detection limit for the lab. So it's taken out almost everything. Sodium's down to 6 from 198. And to me, the most interesting thing here is pH went from 8.1 to 6.23. Now, that's not something people think about when they think RO. It's like, oh, I'm taking out arsenic or taking out whatever. But it's changed their water to slightly corrosive if you use 7 as neutral anyway. And I'm not a chemist, so tell me if I misspoke, Dan. But it makes a difference.
Yeah, it'll make the water very similar to distilled water, which has a slightly acidic pH generally. Reverse osmosis won't take out 100%, but almost. Usually a properly working reverse osmosis unit will take out about 93 to 96% of all the total dissolved solids. One thing I thought was interesting too, we normally think about a softener taking out calcium, magnesium, and that's what you'll see everybody talk about. But if you scan back between the softened and the raw sample, there are some other metallic components that are taken out it's a cation exchange process, so a few other things that are charged will be taken out too. Iron's a good example. Some softeners are not as good at that exchange as others, but we see a lot of softeners that will take out iron pretty effectively too.
Right. Thank you. So someone asked about water softener operation. Basically, how does the softener that uses salt works? And yeah, Dan, you probably can give a pretty good answer for this, so feel free.
I'll try to. Okay. Yeah, I think part of it was what are the components of a softener, and whether or not you have a 2-tank unit or a single tank, there's always going to be something that's holding the resin. That'll be the resin tank. That might be inside of another cylinder that might hold the brine solution, or where you put the salt. So you'll take a bag of salt and you'll dump it into either its own tank or a combined unit, but it's in a tank, and then that'll fill up with water, and so that's called a brine solution. And in the normal, when you're normally using your water in your house, your water's not going through that brine solution itself, it's going through this resin, and so you run the water through the resin, and that's a cation exchange resin, and it will exchange out the calcium, magnesium, and a few other positively charged metallic ions, and exchange those for sodium. You can use potassium too. I haven't looked much recently, but a few years ago somebody was saying that potassium chloride was about 4 times the expense of sodium chloride. I don't know what it's like everywhere, but you may want to do it if you're on a low sodium diet, but basically a softener will exchange out almost all the calcium, magnesium for sodium, so it's definitely going to increase the sodium. But then what happens is your softener switches into this regeneration mode. So it first starts, most of them should be basically like this. I don't know if the plumbing is exactly the same in all softeners, but normally they're going to push a little water backwards through it to rinse off any sediment that collects at the top of the resin, fluffs it up a little bit, and then it goes through its regeneration process where it slowly pushes this brine solution through, and that the chemistry there, the equilibrium, because it's concentrated, will push off the hardness and push that out to waste and recharge the resin with sodium, and once it rinses the extra brine and refills, it'll be ready to go for the next time.
Great, and so Dan also gave us some, well, let me get over to this here. So here's someone who took their sample and tested it right before regeneration. So when all the resin was almost spent, or I guess it wouldn't be spent, but it would be all the spots where things could react have been filled up. And you can see what the sodium, magnesium, calcium, and all that is. And so this is right before regeneration. And then here's what it looked like right after regeneration. So now it's like a fresh tank, so to speak. And pretty interesting, really, that that's what your water softener is doing, is it's removing all these things. And we found by looking at all the water quality samples that come into Dan's lab that in some cases we're even seeing removal of some arsenic. Not a lot. It's not in every case. It kind of depends on the chemistry, but it can, in some cases, remove some arsenic as well.
Yeah, I don't think people usually count on it doing it, but it seems like we usually see, or sometimes see, a little bit of it. I don't know if it's a co-precipitation with iron or adsorption to the iron, but sometimes we see it, sometimes we don't.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm not saying you should count on your softener to remove arsenic, but in some cases we see that. So yeah, and I think it is what I've always attributed it to is a co-precipitation with iron. And I know, especially in municipal plants, sometimes you add iron to improve arsenic removal efficiency. So, okay, so yeah, our well was installed in 2007. How do we find out the depth of our well? We're in a subdivision where our neighbor's well is 180 feet deep. Well, as I mentioned before, if they're built by the same contractor and the subdivision all went in basically at the same time, many times we see all the wells that are very similar in depth in an area like that. As far as finding your well log, it really depends on the state. And since this is 2007, we would expect in almost any state except maybe Pennsylvania and Alaska, you would find your log. And so you can look online, you can then contact that state agency, and they should be able to help you. I know what happens in Illinois is our county provides permits for well drilling. Once the well's drilled, the driller files a log with the county, and then the county submits all those logs back to us. We're not a regulatory agency, they are. We just house the logs and use them for all our scientific work, if you will. And so in Illinois, we would be the folks you'd call to help, but it really depends on the state and who houses the logs. And more and more, we're seeing that states are putting all that information online, and you can find logs just by getting online and doing a little nosing around. So, and if you can't find any kind of records at all, and there's no evidence of a nearby well that would be similar, drilled by the same driller, if you know who that is, all those sorts of things. If you can hire a contractor who could come out and determine the well depth for you, but that's going to cost you a little money. So, but in some cases it's really important. And if your neighbor who remembered the last landowner says, "Oh yeah, I remember when that well was drilled. It was 180 feet deep." I've been to hundreds of wells where a well owner has told me the depth, and we've dropped a tape or somehow measured the well depth, and it ends up being 100 feet shorter or 100 feet deeper than what they thought it was. And so, word of mouth, things get changed, numbers get mixed up, and it's better just to, if you really need to know your well depth or you want to know, to have it done properly. What treatment do I need to do before or after a pump is installed? So there's two ways to look at this. As I thought about this, anytime your well cap is opened, you should disinfect your well because there's a potential to introduce bacteria, and that's just a best practice. Now, if this is a new well where they're installing the pump, the contractor's doing the work, and it hasn't even been used yet, then the contractor likely disinfected the well when he was done. But the best thing for you to do is just call your contractor, your driller, and make sure that's what they did, so that it probably was in many states they're taking a sample after the well's finished to make sure that it's doesn't have coliform or high nitrate, and then so once all that's done, or if you've had a new pump installed, you should disinfect and then sample it to make sure that it's still that it's free of bacteria, and as long as it is, then you don't need to do anything else. If not, you might need to disinfect again. And if I mentioned the tree root example earlier today, if it turns out that you keep disinfecting and you still keep having bacteria hits, then there's something else going on you need to investigate. A lot of folks tell us, well, I was told I should just pour some bleach down my well every spring, or I just ran into a well owner who told me he puts bleach in his well every month. And that's a bad idea, is the bottom line. Straight bleach is too concentrated. It can be harmful to rubber seals and components in your pump and your well, your pitless. And so, what we recommend is you should only disinfect when you have to. which means you've got a bacteria hit, which means you sampled first, or you've had your well open for some reason and you decide to disinfect. We've looked at literally probably between 70 and 100 different guides and flyers and everything else put out by many health departments and other groups on how to disinfect your well. The one that we've settled on as being a really good best practice to follow is the water treatment solution, or is the Minnesota Department of Health guide on how to disinfect your well. And if you go on our website, which is privatewellclass.org, there's a list of resources, and under that list you'll see for lesson 10 there's the lessons called water treatment solutions, and we list about, I don't remember, 8 to 12 different resources that are available from different state agencies or federal agencies, and one of them is that disinfection manual from Minnesota. It's very thorough. It explains why you need to mix the bleach to a certain concentration first, how to flush your lines, all those things. And it's a really good guide on how to disinfect your well if you're going to do it yourself. And what I always tell people, some folks say, well owners shouldn't disinfect their wells themselves. And my argument to that is many times well owners don't have the funds to hire a contractor to disinfect their well. So I'd much rather them do it themselves and do it right than not do it at all. But if you are concerned or worried that you might not do it the right way, then you can always call a contractor or a well driller and ask them to disinfect your well for a fee. So we were asked about emergency situations. Is there a guide on how much liquid bleach to add to small containers of water, like a gallon jug? Dan found this flyer on CDC's website, and it's really helpful. It walks you right through it, tells you how much to use. If it's clear versus if it's cloudy, they're assuming there's more stuff to kill, I guess. And so, and at the bottom here is this really long URL, which you're not going to be able to write down right now. But if you go to Google and just type CDC Make Water Safe, this is the second link. You can see that it shows this URL. But if you go to the first link on CDC's webpage, it's actually a much more robust webpage than this flyer that talks about disinfection and a bunch of other things that would be appropriate for emergency situations. And, that's where I would send people. So this handy guide certainly tells you what to do with a gallon jug, and all for good reason. But there's also a lot of other resources available, and under this CDC's Make Water Safe webpage. Is groundwater from my private well any less safe to drink than treated surface water from a large water treatment plant? So I'm assuming that means community water supply. And generally, no. Actually, groundwater is probably safer than surface water if it's raw water. Surface water is going to have bacteria in it and all those sorts of things. But because it's a public water supply and it's regulated, including testing and treating the water to make sure it's safe, the difference is you have confidence that the large water treatment plant water, whether it's surface water or groundwater, is safe to drink. They have to make sure it is. They have to test to be sure it is. They have to treat to remove anything that might be harmful. And with anything else, part of our whole message is you should sample your well once a year for coliform nitrate. That's so you're sure your well still has integrity near the surface and it's not letting things into your well, and that with confidence that there's not contaminants in your well. And so, the difference is just having that confidence in the result. In general, a lot of groundwater, even in some states, small subdivisions that may have one well and they're considered a public water supply, don't even chlorinate, or they may not be required to, because the groundwater is from an aquifer that's protected. It doesn't have bacteria. It's not high in any contaminant at all, and the water's fine just like it is. And so, generally, no, surface water, treated water isn't any better, but I guess my message is you should sample so you have confidence that there's not something else going on. And that's in any case. We had a lot of questions about arsenic, lead, even one about hexavalent chromium. The best thing you can do is contact your local or state health department and find out if any of these are a concern in your area. I don't know a lot about hexavalent chromium, but I know certainly it's dangerous. And if there is, it's not naturally occurring, is my understanding. And so if you have those issues, there would be a reason. Just like I know in the state of Rhode Island, they require testing for MTBE, which is a fuel additive, and that's just because of the number of facilities in their state that may have leaked that particular chemical, and it's enough that they require that whenever there's a property transfer now, where I don't believe any other state does, unless they're asking for all the MCLs and all those things. So, and as far as options for lead, that's a little different animal, because most of the time the lead isn't coming from your well. It's coming from your premise plumbing or your service lines if you're in a community. And so I think I put something later about that regarding, we have a lead web page and some things. Dan, do you have anything to add? Anything you'd like to say?
No, if you've covered it later. I mean, I guess a quick answer could be, if you do suspect it's a plumbing issue, which, like Steve said, is usually a plumbing issue, let your water flush for a long time before you use it in the morning. If it's used routinely, it's probably getting enough flushing, but typically it's associated with some local plumbing source. So flushing is a really easy way to try to minimize your risk.
Okay. There we go. Oh, yeah, I guess I put it here. So one of the questions was how to resolve issues related to pH and metals. And I'm referring back to the lead information. That's really lead and copper are probably the biggest issue related to pH and corrosive water. And so we did a lead webinar on August 30th, and we set up a web page that lists a lot of the sources of information that we used for that. But as I mentioned earlier, we record every webinar, and if you go on our web page and search under webinars, you can find this, what well owners need to know about lead. It's similar to this. It's probably an hour and a half long. We provided information from a couple of other experts, one from US EPA on GAC filters, and one about corrosive water in Virginia from Virginia Tech, as well as then a lot of these resources from CDC and EPA. And there's a lot of good information here if you're really interested in understanding what's going on with lead. In some cases, if the water is really corrosive, the Virginia example, they may have galvanized pipe or galvanized drop pipe, which also contains lead. And in the Piedmont aquifer, for instance, the pH can be low as 4.5. And so in those cases, the lead's actually leaching from the drop pipe in the well. And where in most cases, the best practice is to let your water run for a few minutes to make sure that if you have lead pipes or lead solder, you're getting that flushed out. They've seen high lead values as far as an hour out with continually running water out of a tap because it's actually in the well because of the galvanized piping. So, the best thing to do is to test your water to determine if it's corrosive. And then from there you can decide or determine if you have copper or lead pipes, or if you have lead solder or brass fittings. Your pump has brass fittings in all likelihood. All those things can contribute lead. And, the one message that I've learned in all of this is it seems like, lead tends to be one of the easiest things to leach out of components into water. Because, galvanized pipe can be less than 2% lead on the surface, or 1.5, I think, and yet you still see a fair amount of lead in some of those situations. So if you have other questions, you can always email us. But I recommend you go through these resources, and that should provide you with a lot of answers about lead. So that's the questions that we put up for today. And quickly, I want to talk about the private well class. It's 10 lessons, as I mentioned, and you sign up on our webpage, and it's self-paced. So it sends you a lesson as a PDF. Starts out talking about how water gets into your well and how it flows through the ground, talks about well types, common problems with wells as far as the mechanics, all the way through source water protection and treatment. And it's on this webpage, privatewellclass.org. And at the bottom of the front page, there's a place to click on Learn by Email. It takes you to this page. We just ask for your email address and your first name, and then where you live lists a state. And that's really so we can show our funder that and the US EPA that we're actually reaching folks all over the country. And it sends you one lesson a week. And for every person that does our evaluation and says that once a week is too often, another person says that once a week is too long. And so we've left it that way. It seems to be a pretty even split when it's brought up as an issue. So this is the front page. I got these slides backwards, I guess, but click on Learn by Email, and it takes you to that last page. We have podcasts. We have short videos. I'll show those in a second. And I mentioned the disinfection manual that Minnesota Department of Health has. It's on this resource list. So lesson 1 is called The Science of Groundwater. And in addition to the 8 to 10 page lesson that we send you, there's this resources here where you can go in and look at what other folks have put together from all kinds of different agencies or universities or federal agencies, and give you more background on those topics. And so under lesson 10, you would find the disinfection manual I mentioned earlier. We record our videos. I already showed us a clip of this. I won't go into this anymore. You can see we have 23 webinars so far that we've recorded going back about 4 years. And then we also have these training videos, which are 3 to 5 minutes long, and they answer a specific question. What do I do after a fire? How does my pressure tank work? And, some things we've had, 70 or 80,000 hits on these already. And I know like the pressure tank video has had well over 40,000 all by itself, which kind of tells us that there's not a lot of information out there about pressure tanks for people. And so it's, you can look through that list, and if it's something you're interested in, it's only 3 to 5 minutes long, and it gives you just kind of a quick run through of how the system works. The goal of our class really is to help people understand why their well is important, why you need to understand how it works, and what you can do to help protect yourself and your family from risk. And so we think we're accomplishing that to some degree. These webinars certainly help. And again, we have on our webpage a phone number and an email address. You can always email us later or email us with other questions, and we can get back to you. The whole point of all this is really to help you. It's really the third bullet. Hopefully, if you've taken our class and participated in our webinars, then it helps you learn enough about your well that you're asking better questions, you know who to contact locally, and you're able to learn more about your well and about your surroundings and the aquifers where you live. And it's about understanding your well log and where your water's coming from. So and as far as being aware, the best way and the way to have the most confidence is if you sample your well regularly. And it's believed that almost 70% of well owners have never sampled their well, not even once. And really, you should be sampling for coliform nitrate every year. It's a cheap way to be sure and have some confidence that your well's still working the way it's supposed to be. So we're going to jump right to the questions, and this is the last slide, I think, and I will pull over, let me pull over the, I mentioned we use Google Docs, and so I'm going to make this full page. Hang on 1 second here, and I'm going to make this a little bigger real quick. Okay. And so I'm just going to scroll down real quick to show everybody where did, oh, I went to the wrong place. Here we go. Okay. So we're going to run through these, and then Dan, feel free to jump in. For sampling suggestion, if a well is determined as GWUDI, which is groundwater under the direct influence of surface water, what frequency would you recommend? I understand drinking water under the influence requires to be treated for drinking purposes. However, groundwater under the influence wells for irrigation purposes, what is your suggestion in terms of sampling? For irrigation purposes, the target is bacteria. Well, if it's under the influence, then it's treated as surface water, which means you need to assume it has bacteria. I can't, depending on how much irrigation you're talking about, if it's center pivot irrigation, where it's 1,000, 1,500 gallons a minute, trying to chlorinate that would be expensive, I would imagine. And so as far as determining if it has bacteria in it, well, I would think anytime, if it's a river or a large stream, anytime there was a big rise, I mean, there's really no way to answer this as far as being confident that your frequency would be right. Does it flood every spring? If you're drinking, one of the examples I use a lot of times is you buy this 5-acre property and it's on a bluff over this nice pretty stream, and after you buy it and start building your house, they try to put in a well on the bluff and they realize there's no water there. They end up going down next to the stream and putting a well in. Well, that stream floods every spring. The well gets overtopped. They're going to continue to have bacteria problems unless they mitigate that by either having a really tall casing, which we've seen, or they are sure that it's completely sealed and that the water has no influence. So, I would certainly, my gut says you'd want to sample more often, for sure, because if it's under the influence of surface water, then it's much more likely to have bacteria. But, even then, I guess I'm him-hauling here. I don't have a good answer. So, the target is bacteria. It's interesting. If it's a lot of water, yeah. I guess if you would you mind emailing us a little more information, and I can certainly look into it if you'd like. But, that's an unusual situation. So, or if, some irrigation's right out of a ditch or whatever, and you certainly have to assume that's got bacteria all the time. So, if on a private well, if someone has groundwater under the influence, or if it's surface water, or if it's a spring, then we would recommend continuous disinfection, whether that be chlorination or UV. That's the best way to handle a situation where you can't be sure at any given time that there might be bacteria issues. So I just realized that would be tough for irrigation if it's very much water, because then you're treating a lot of water. Okay. Is it possible for groundwater quality to change suddenly as a result of increased draw in a local aquifer, a new neighborhood with 75 users on community wells, or if blasting has been done nearby to develop housing in shallow bedrock area? I live in an area that's relatively high naturally occurring arsenic as well as radon. There's a lot of things that can influence water quality. We just had a situation where somebody was putting in an oil well, and they put surface casing in through the shallow aquifers that are actually used for drinking water in order to seal those off, and then they're pushing water down into the deeper formation for the oil extraction, and their surface casing was breached and they didn't know it, and some of the nearby private wells started flowing, and they never had flowed before. And so they're introducing, not natural water into that area. We've seen where the chemistry's changed because of a small earthquake, and water levels change, those sorts of things. If it's an area where the aquifer's low yield, the chemistry even within the well can change depending on where the water level is. So if let's say you have a 300-foot bedrock well and it's low yielding, which means it pumps less than, say, 3 or 4 gallons a minute, you use very much water and you've lowered the water level in that well maybe 150 feet, and you're exposing all this rock and minerals to air that usually don't interact with air, and they cause a lot of chemistry changes. And so we've seen where the water quality in that well varies by the hour based on where the water level is. So it's certainly possible for the water quality to change. Certainly the best thing is if you have samples before and after. It depends on the aquifer, and something like this to really tell you definitively what's happened would require someone to do a groundwater study in your local area, your state or your state geological survey or somebody like that. So that's, I would recommend contacting those folks or your USGS. And if it's, the water quality's changed such that there's a health risk and you've identified that, then certainly bring in your primacy agency or your state health agency. So I hope that answers your question. Is it possible that contaminants in an aquifer can be concentrated in time of drought? I would say generally no. It's not, a lot of times if there's a contaminant in an aquifer, it's naturally occurring. Like I mentioned, Tazewell County, Illinois has naturally occurring arsenic. It's actually arsenopyrite is the mineral that's mixed in with the sand and gravel that has arsenic on it. And whether it's released or not kind of depends on the chemistry, and it's very local. And so, I guess again, in time of drought, it really depends on what's going on with the aquifer itself. If it's a buried, confined aquifer, you may have a drought at the surface, and it hasn't affected water levels in the aquifer at all. And it's not necessarily the contaminants, even in the case I mentioned before, where the water levels dropped several hundred feet. It may not be that it's concentrated because of drought. It may be that the chemistry's changed because of air introduction that allows some of those reactions to occur, and it, precipitates minerals or allows them to go in solution. So, is it possible? I don't know enough about groundwater chemistry to give you an answer, but I wouldn't say that they typically you'd think that any would be concentrated. So, yeah. I can certainly ask somebody else, though, who may know more. Yeah. Why do you think that regulators and or the real estate industry do not require water quality or quantity testing for property sale? Well, we tell well owners, and for every well owner out there who may be, eventually buying a house, or anybody who may be buying a house that has a well, I would treat it as buyer beware. If I'm buying a house, I'm sampling for all the things I want to sample for, even if it costs me money, or I'm requiring them to do that through a neutral party before I buy the house. I can give you a number of examples. One is a woman who called us where the county told them that for the real estate transaction, all they had to do was nitrate and coliform. They did that, it was fine. A year later, she went and tested the well on her own and found out that she has 150 ppb of arsenic. So then she did some nosing around and found out that this aquifer where she's at is known for having high arsenic. That would be really frustrating to buy that house, and now all of a sudden you weren't aware because you moved in from out of state or whatever and didn't have that information. Another case, I was sampling a bunch of wells in a rural area, and I had a well owner tell me, you can sample my well if you don't send me the results and you collect it from an outside tap when I'm not home. Excuse me. And I asked him why would he want me to do that? And he said because he was trying to sell his home, and there's a form you have to fill out that says that you know of nothing derogatory or negative about your well or water quality, and he wanted to be able to honestly answer that question truthfully. So I don't know why it's different. We've talked to a number of federal agencies, and we're trying to work with them and the real estate industry to say that, it should be the same sampling everywhere that covers all the bases and that also takes into account local conditions. And that's what really everyone should do. And so, a friend of mine bought his house in 2006 here, it's in the county I live in. And when I asked him about what sampling he had done at his well, he lives out in the country and has a private well, his realtor collected a bacteria sample and took it to the county health department. And that's the only sampling he's ever done, nothing else. And that's all they were required to do in 2006. And so, in some states there are no rules at all. Other states like New Jersey and Oregon, you're required to sample for all the primary drinking water contaminants at a property sale. So New Jersey has, depending on how you consider this, but a program where the state lab comes out and collects a sample at the time of property sale for all the primary drinking water contaminants. Boy, excuse me. They share the results with the buyer and the seller. The buyer and the seller have to determine who pays for it as part of their overall transaction, and the state keeps the information, and it's private and it can't be FOIA'd. And so, you know what you're getting into. The landowner knows if he has to remediate, and you can negotiate to do that before it's actually final. And there should be a lot of changes. HUD's own rules aren't consistent in their own property transfer documents as far as what should be sampled for depending on the situation. They say if there's a local jurisdiction that has regulations, you use that. If there's not, then you use state. And if there's neither, you're supposed to sample for all the primary drinking water contaminants. And I know talking to other folks, it's not in any of the people involved, the real estate buyer, the real estate folks, the mortgage company. The only people that really care to make sure the water quality is good, if you will, are the people buying the home and the people who have who are on this who are responsible for the loan should the loan default, because it's their property and it's their property values that are going to be affected. And so it really is buyer beware. And I think it's really, there's not a lot of wherewithal because of all the work it would cause to try to get that done, but it's certainly necessary. So I apologize, that was a long answer, but it's something that I've looked into a lot, and we're trying to work toward having some changes made so that it is consistent nationwide. And that's a tough row to hoe, let me tell you. So if my well is in a vault with a concrete slab on top and entry hatch, does the vault need to be vented? That's really an OSHA question, but I would say certainly. Gases can build up that may suffocate you. I know I worked on a project where we had wells that were in a vault down by St. Louis, and we had all these rules we had to follow, using meters to test the air and all that stuff before we could even go in there. You see a lot of, every once in a while you see an article either in the news or you read something or hear something about someone who's went in a vault and they were incapacitated. Their coworker or friend went in after them, and it happened to them too because there was no oxygen. But there could also be a leak. Wells sometimes bleed methane. So yeah, I would never get in a vault that wasn't vented, and I didn't have some confidence that there was oxygen there and it was safe. It's really, if it's avoidable, you should avoid ever having a well in a sealed space like that, and would be my opinion. What do you suggest for having a well having a slow recovery rate? Well, there's if it's a low yield well, which is what I'll assume that is, so it means it only produces a few gallons a minute before the water level gets down to the pump, then there's not a lot you can do. We've seen a number of different solutions, I guess, but what it requires is, let me just give you the best example I have is some folks who contacted us. They have a well in Colorado, and they're on the western slope of the Rockies. And their well only produces about a half a gallon a minute that they can sustain. So if they pump it harder than that, they end up breaking suction and reaching the pump intake. So what they've done as a solution is they put in a 3,000 gallon cistern and have a pump inside of it that can pump into the house, and they basically pump their well continuously so that it's pumping half a gallon a minute 24/7 and filling up that cistern, so that in the morning or in the evening when they're taking showers and they're doing those things or needing water for washing, that sort of thing, there's water available. So the well's basically pumping at its capacity constantly at a very low rate, and then they're storing it so that they can use it in times of need, and it's pumping even when they're not there. And we see that every once in a while where someone has a low yield well, and maybe instead of a 100-gallon pressure tank, or they have an actual extra tank down in their basement that's maybe 500 gallons that it can pump into continuously when everybody's sleeping and that sort of thing. That's really as far as unless you're going to do something to the well, and I guess that's the other option. Sometimes people blast wells. I have no familiarity with any of that, though, just to try to create more fractures and more water availability. And you'd have to talk to a contractor or find out if it's even something you can do in your state. Okay. It's 2:30. I'm going to go down here to this comment. We'll see. Okay, so yeah, so our lab basically does inorganics and metals, right, Dan?
Yeah, ours is a pretty comprehensive, fairly close to a complete inorganic carbon contaminant test. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Well, it says, I agree. Most well owners don't, you have well owners who don't want to spend the money, which I understand. I'm still reading here. So
yeah, me too.
Right, and so I agree, and all of this is voluntary, and that's the problem. You can explain to people why they should and why they shouldn't. Hang on. It's kind of like our class. I've worked here for 30 years, and I would say 99% of the time when a well owner calls me, it's because he has a problem, and they want an answer. They're not interested in learning about how water flows in their well or how, what well types there might be or any of those things. They want an answer to their problem. And so what we decided to do with this class is say, well, if you want to know how to solve that problem, it's in Lesson 5 or it's in Lesson 7. And you really need to take the class. The idea behind the class is to teach you to be a better well owner, to be a better steward of your aquifer, to be more informed and understand how to help yourself. Some people don't want to do that. They're not willing to, or they maybe in this case, as far as the sampling, maybe they're not willing to pay the money. And what I guess I'm saying is, yeah. And I guess I'm not clear. I guess what I'm saying is the two tests are quite a bit different from nitrate and coliform versus everything else. Which most homeowners won't do, and I get that. A lot of well owners won't, but we're trying to explain to them why they should, and yeah, I don't understand this one point here. If the well is an existing well and old, this type of test might not even be available. I don't understand why you couldn't sample for the list of constituents we provided regardless.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understood that either, Steve, but yeah, we get samples in our lab from all over. Right.
Well, and so we're all agreeing here that it's beneficial to do a complete sampling of your water well. Right. But you can only recommend it, and that's certainly for sure.
Steve, I think your point earlier about checking with local people to see what problems are in your area might help with costs. If you can't afford everything, you can just check for things that are known of local interest.
Sure. Yeah, I hope that gets to your point. But no, we certainly agree. It's always beneficial to do a complete sampling. Even be able to do mass balance or to look at even on the corrosion side, there are, 5 different indices that you can use to determine whether something's corrosive or not. And I know what our lab does is looks at all 5 of those and uses the most conservative result. So even if we run across water where, the Langley index may say it's not corrosive, but another index says it is, then we tell people, this says it doesn't, but, this particular thing does because of alkalinity or, whatever, and that, you should still be concerned and you should understand what kind of piping you have and all that kind of stuff. So I'm getting off track here, but yeah. Okay, I think that's all we have today. And so thank you for your time. And if you have any other questions or if we didn't answer your question, I apologize. Feel free to email us. And we will try to get as many of those up on our FAQ page in the next month, basically. And we're working on that. We have a couple folks working on that every day. And so, yeah, our next webinar is, I think, the 23rd maybe of January. And you can look on our webpage for that information. So thanks for attending. And everyone have a happy holiday. And thanks, Katie and Dan.